Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have what I'm calling my week 1 of my Goodreads challenge update. Now, admittedly, it hasn't been a full week at the time of recording, and when I post this, it will be 4 days from now, and I've read, hopefully, several more books, and it will be beyond 1 week. But I'm gonna go ahead and film the check-in now, because I have some things to talk about. The plan is to go through each of the 3 categories that I am making my way through. I don't think that I will be able to completely finish any category by the end of the 2 weeks. I may not. I will get closest in young adult, but my plan is to go through each of these and to have up a graphic that I made that includes the books that I'm not going to read, the books that I have read, how I read those books, whether physical, audio, or ebook, and my ranking of them at that time. So I'm going to go in the same order for each check-in. And this first week, I'm also going to talk about the books that I have read prior to the start of the challenge. But I'm going to talk about each book in terms of ranking from worst to best. Now, in future check-ins, I won't talk about those other books. I'll just simply talk about the new books that I've read since the last check-in. So we're gonna go ahead and start, because this is the one I have up first, we're gonna go ahead and start with adult fantasy. As you look at this image, you will see that I have crossed off 2 books. That's The War of Two Queens, which is book 4 in the From Blood and Ash series, and House of Sky and Breath, which is book 2 in the Crescent City series. I have no interest in either of those series. That is not my kind of fantasy. I am not a romance girl. That goes to fantasy romance as well. And I have no interest in those, so I'm not going to read those. I'm going to start with the 5th, and that is Daughter of the Moon Goddess. Daughter of the Moon Goddess is one that I read once the nominees were released, and right now it is the lowest ranked out of all the books that I've read in this category. Do I think that it will stay the lowest ranked? Probably not. If it stayed the lowest rank and everything else was amazing, I would take that. I just highly doubt that it's going to stay lowest rank, but it is 5th, and I listened to it as an audiobook. In the description down below, I'm going to link the vlogs where I talk about each of these books. And for most of these in this first video, it is going to be my weekly vlog 34 for the initial week. Daughter of the Moon Goddess, it went over a lot of things that I've seen before. It had issues on whether or not it was YA or adult, and the pacing just felt weird. I heard Reagan from Peruse Project talking about this book, and she mentioned the thing about pacing, and I think that's what ultimately brought this down to about a 3.5 stars for me, which is not bad. But it is right now ranked 5th out of the 5 books that I've read for this. Then we come to number 4, which is a book that I read prior to the challenge, and that is The Stardust Thief. I got this book as part of, I think, Fairy Loot, and so I have a special edition with more purple tones to it than the orange that you see in the image. I thought this was a good book, decent book. I think I ended up rating it a 4 stars. I think in comparison, though, to things like The Sands of Arawia, which I love even more, it didn't quite make that rank, but it still was a really good read. So all of these, even though it's second to last right now, it's not a bad read. Moving up to 3rd, we have the other book that I have read on this list prior to the start of the challenge, and that is A River Enchanted. Now here, you have a 5-star read. That is how much I love the other 2 books that are ranked above it. River Enchanted was one of the very first, I think, Illumicrate books, and I read it back in March or April, so a lot earlier in the year, but I remember absolutely adoring the story, especially the relationship building between 2 of the secondary characters. Just so real and raw and honest. Hands down, loved it. And for a 5-star read to be my 3rd ranked, you know I had to love the other books even more. That brings to number 2, Legends and Lattes. And that is one that I read finally for this project, and I did read that as an audiobook. The only physical books that I've read so far on this list are the 2 that I read prior to the start. Legends and Lattes, the reason that I ranked it above A River Enchanted is because the relationship between the two main characters in A River Enchanted, I didn't like as much. And that sort of brought it down a little bit, even though it's still a 5-star read. Legends of Lattes, definitely a 5-star read. I loved every single bit about this cozy fantasy. Hands down, I can't find a flaw in this book. Maybe the only flaw is that it's so short and I want more of it. And that brings to number 1. Confession, I haven't quite finished this book at the time of filming. I will finish it by the time this goes up. I knew that there was no way out of all of the books on this list that I could rank it anything less than number 1. Just because I have invested so much into the Cosmere, and I love Brandon Sanderson's work. I love when he brings in and ties in all of those things. It's just phenomenal. Will I ultimately vote for this one? I don't know. But right now, it's number 1 for me. I do mention in my vlog that I think it's a little unfair that it's in the category, because the people that are going to vote for it are going to vote based on popularity, obviously, but also they are people that are fully invested. And the only way to really understand this book is if you've put in the work and read all of the other Cosmere books prior to this. There are probably things that I'm missing out because I have not read Rhythm of War. I'm planning to read that in December. So that's where adult fantasy is as of this moment. Next, I am going to go to young adult fantasy to stay in the same genre. So in young adult fantasy, I'm crossing out only one book, and that is These Twisted Bonds, because I read These Hollow Vows last year, absolutely detested it. So I debated going back and forth on whether or not I was going to read this, decided, nope, not going to read it. So that is the only one that I'm crossing off this list, and I still have the highest chance of finishing this list prior to the end of the 2 weeks. So we'll start at the bottom, and the bottom here is Violet Made of Thorns. And I've talked about in previous vlogs, I'll see if I can remember which one I mentioned this in, but this is a book that I got in 2 book boxes, Owl Crate and Fairy Loot, I believe. And I was trying to decide which one I was going to keep and ended up keeping neither of them. I do not have this book anymore. It wasn't terrible. Like, I think it was a very low 3-star, but ultimately I didn't like the relationship. I didn't like how it was built up. I thought there were a lot of flaws that could have been solved with this one. Next, we have another book that I read prior to this, and that is Hotel Magnifique. In my mind, my experience with both Violet Made of Thorns and Hotel Magnifique were about the same. I have unhauled Hotel Magnifique. I read that back in the summer. Ultimately, I think the idea of the world was really solid, but the way that the relationships were portrayed just felt so unrealistic. And then the ultimate introduction of the villainy came way too late in the book, so the pacing was off. So I didn't like either of those. Number 6, we have Only a Monster. And this is where we start to get into the fact that I do like all of the books that are rated above number 7 with Hotel Magnifique and Violet Made of Thorns at number 8. Only a Monster. I did not think that I would enjoy. Part of that was because the copy that I have is an Owl Crate version, and it's just not as pretty. So yes, cover buys. But I really found myself intrigued with the concept that was going on in this book and how it was building up the relationships and the idea with time travel and what had been done to the hero in this book. I found absolutely fascinating. The only reason it's number 6 is because I've loved so many books on this list. Number 5 is Gallant. And I think that's an unpopular opinion, but I really enjoyed Gallant. I thought that the way that V.E. Schwab built the character, whose name I can't remember at the moment, and how she was nonverbal, but it was not magically fixed, but also how that tied into the haunting of the house and the parallel worlds and things going on in there. I really enjoyed it. And I know that that's an unpopular opinion. People thought it read young. The fact that I've read a lot of middle grades, I don't think this was middle grade. I think it was on the younger side of YA. And I think people say it reads middle grade just because YA keeps getting aged up, and it shouldn't. Number 4, we have Cytonic. And as much as I love Brandon Sanderson, Cytonic is the weakest of the 3 books in this series out so far. And I say weakest, but I still really love it. I think it's a high 4-star, not quite 4.5. I thought I missed the friendship, the team aspect that both Skyward and Starsight had. I missed it in Cytonic, but Cytonic does a lot of really incredible things. And I'm really looking forward to finish off the series. Then at number 3, we have The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. I missed out on getting this as a FairyLou book by 1 month. It was the one right before. I wish I had that version. I adored this book. I read it as an audiobook a few months ago. And I think the way that Axio describes the spirit world, I've never seen any of the Studio Ghibli Spirited Away or any of those things. But that vibe that I've heard people talk about, I can tell was in there. And I loved the complicated building of the relationships with the characters that were in the spirit world. It just was phenomenal for me. And I love that she did so much in a standalone. And this is a 5-star read for me. So a 5-star at number 3. So you can tell that number 2 and number 1 are going to be phenomenal. Number 2, and I really debated on where I was going to rank Dragon's Promise and Bloodmarked. Dragon's Promise, I read as an arc. So excited to read it early. I literally, as soon as I finished it, purchased a pre-order like 5 seconds after I finished it. I love this duology from Elizabeth Lim. Hands down, I think Sings Crimson Cranes and The Dragon's Promise totally outshine Unravel the Dusk and Spin the Dawn. Said those backwards. But The Dragon's Promise, I adored. The way that she built, the pacing is immaculate. You wouldn't think that because it has different parts to it. But unlike other books, like Daughter of the Moon Goddess, Elizabeth Lim does a masterful job with this. And I love this story so much. Now, what put Bloodmark over the top was just how invested I became in these characters and the way that Tracy Deonn really shone such a harsh but realistic light on the way that systems are just so messed up. So phenomenal. If a book can make me as viscerally angry as many parts of this book did, and also cheering for characters and wholeheartedly rooting for them and getting invested as much as this one did, it has to be number 1. Looking at the rest of the books on this list, I don't see any others that could possibly topple this. I'm gonna leave myself open to being surprised, but hands down, Bloodmarked is number 1 for me in this category. So that leaves, finally, the middle grade and children's category. So this is the one where I've crossed off the most, and those are all the children's books. Now, I considered doing these. However, my library doesn't have any of them, and I do not feel qualified to evaluate children's books, and I'm just not interested in reading children's books. So those are why those 4 are marked out. Now, this is the one where I've read the most from as part of the challenge. And we will start with number 5. It's not going to stay as number 5. It's probably going to go way down towards the bottom. And I hate that it's going to go so far down. Originally, I got an e-arc of this on NetGalley, and then the author actually reached out to me and offered me a copy to see if an actual physical copy. I thought, wow, yeah, I would love to. After reading it and how dense it was, there was just so many words. I don't remember a lot from it, but I just remember being so incredibly disappointed at the lack of quality to the writing. I wonder if the fact that the author reached out to so many people, like educators and things like that, to get physical copies in hand is why it's on this list. And I felt terrible giving it such a low rating, but I just did not enjoy it. And I didn't think it was super high quality. Engaging story, but the kind of story that a dad tells to their kids at bedtimes, which is what he said, how it originated. So unfortunately, that one is probably going to be towards the bottom, if not the absolute bottom of the list. I honestly hope it's the bottom because I don't want to read anything bad or anything else bad. Number 4, I have as Small Town Pride. I don't think it's going to stay at number 4. It's probably going to go down. And that's just, as I mentioned in the reading blog, it just gets way too preachy. And I noticed that with the other book of Phil Stamper's, The Gravity of Us, that I've read before, which is YA. The main character in this does not feel like an 8th grader. He feels way too old. The inconsistencies with how school is portrayed in these books as a teacher, that's just a point that never goes in their favor if they portray school unrealistically. Then we get to my middle of the road book, which is kind of fitting that it's here at number 3, which is middle of the books that I've read on this list so far, and that is The Marvelers. I thought it was a unique concept. I loved the hat tips that Danielle Clayton gave to other authors like Kwame Mbalia and Jason Reynolds, and I think there's one other mention in there that I can't remember, and there's probably more that I missed. I loved all of those. And I think it was a really unique concept, but it wasn't fleshed out enough. That I could see holes in the magic system. I could see holes where she had talked about something in the plot and then it came up again later as a new reveal when she'd already talked about it earlier. And so ultimately it ended up as a 3.5 stars for me, very much middle of the road. Then we get to How to Heal a Griffin, and this is at number 2 because I thought it was just a really wholesome story. I loved the way that the Greek culture was portrayed in like modern Greece and not like the Percy Jackson aspect of it. I thought it was engaging. Did it really stand out to me? No. It was like average but high average. So I think this might have gotten a 4-star for me, but it would be a low 4-star. So unlike the other lists, the only standout on this list that I have read so far is Amari and the Great Game. And Amari and the Great Game so outmatches every single other book that I've read on this list. And I can't think of another one on here that might come close. Amari and the Great Game is so phenomenal. I don't know what was going on in my head when I read Amari and the Night Brothers last year and why I thought it was just so average. I'm so glad I gave it another chance. And I read that again this year. I don't know what was going on in my brain. Like, I can't understand it. Amari and the Great Game is so phenomenal. The way that B.B. Alston builds up the relationship, the way that he talks about how, like, I think, like, the focus on this was how information can be manipulated and twisted to suit certain things. So well done. This was definitely a 5-star read for me, and I'm so glad that it's on this list. That's my week 1 check-in. Total, let me count them up real quick. Total, I've read 7 books so far in this first week, but there's a lot more books, obviously, that I talked about. And I actually have read another middle grades book, but it's not the one on the list yet, and that is number 3, Everblaze, in the Keeper of the Lost Cities series. I don't know if I will get to Stellaloon. I probably won't, and that's unfortunate, but I honestly think, though, that Keeper of the Lost Cities is the only thing that could come close to unseating Amari, so maybe it's a good thing that I'm not getting to Stellaloon. Who knows? But in this upcoming week, I hope to tackle even more of them. I'm probably going to seek out more of the middle grades list so I can have more of a sampling. The week 2 check-in will be, I will post it right before the end of voting for the first round, the, I guess, semifinal round, the opening round, whatever they're calling it. And I will, in that check-in, tell you which ones that I'm going to vote for. I'm still going to keep the project going beyond that, and I'm still going to be reading ones that probably may not have made it beyond the opening round. So I'm going to ultimately rank them and then compare my ranking at the end. So there we have week 1, my week 1 check-in for my Goodreads project. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.